And we were at the table document on section implement the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, and I will give the floor to Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's clear that the N.W.T. Department of Justice got their hands all over this one. I want to note that we're implementing it within the constitutional framework. We're passing legislation and policies that best reflect the principles set out in UNDRIP. Some history here. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People was vetoed by Canada at the United Nations because it provides free, prior, and informed consent to Indigenous peoples for any resource projects taking care on their land. Since that time in Canada, we've kind of evolved, and there's been this conversation, well, consent is not a veto, which I think is really a watering down of what UNDRIP was trying to accomplish. Can the Premier please clarify, when we implement UNDRIP, does it provide Indigenous peoples the right to veto resource projects on their lands? Thank you.
Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had earlier said that I'm glad to have a lawyer in the House. I'm glad to have a few lawyers in the House. So to answer the lawyer's question, I will allow Martin to answer that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think the short answer is not necessarily. When we say implement it within the constitutional framework of Canada, I don't think we're saying anything different than the Government of Canada has said. And we have to recognize that the constitutional framework is the supreme law, and whatever we do has to fit within it. And this is why it's important to have discussions with Indigenous governments to come to as much of a common understanding as possible of what do we mean when we say we're going to fully implement UNDRIP in Canada. So it's important to come to that understanding. There might be circumstances where consent will be required, just as there is now in our constitutional framework, but it might not be every circumstance where our constitutional framework provides that Aboriginal rights can be balanced against other interests as well. So very much looking forward to continuing that conversation and getting as much clarity and common understanding as we can. I should also point out, though, that the French version of UNDRIP says, well, aim to achieve the free, prior, and informed consent, which is language that the federal government has also adopted. So there's much to talk about, though, to get as much common understanding as we can. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Goldney. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Spoken like a true Canadian lawyer using the French interpretation. My second question is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People provides Indigenous people the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages. Right now, the closest we are in the Northwest Territories to doing this is the Clecho with their self-government. Are we intending to amend the Education Act, amend the education formula that would come with that, change the role of the education councils to allow Indigenous peoples to have the right to control their educational systems? And are we willing to do that without necessarily settling and implementing treaty land resources and self-government agreements, the priority prior to this? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Madam Premier.
Absolutely, Madam Premier, or Madam Chair, sorry. The whole intention to review the Act is that Indigenous governments are moving more into self-government. They have a right to draw down aspects such as education, health, etc. And so we would need to make sure that we open the pathways so that that can happen. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. All right. All right. I will move on to Member for Des Cho.
Merci, Madam Chair. Madam Premier, I recall you stating as soon as you got into office that you were phoning all the Indigenous groups to have discussions. I'm not certain if you did go into the communities, but I'm kind of wondering if any part of your discussions mentioned these two mandate priority items, the settle and implementation and the UNDRIP. And also, you know, rather than waiting, I don't know why we're waiting for summer. I think inside buildings, it feels like summer. It's warm, so, you know, even tonight, I would suggest, you know, to draft up a letter to all the Indigenous groups on these two items and have them come back with their comments moving forward. You know, I realize you still want to sit and meet with them, but I'm pretty sure they're well aware of this UNDRIP for quite a number of years and probably really want to see it implemented because it helps them. And also, it's the territorial government, you know, recognizing them as the true peoples of this country, of this territory, and that we work and move ahead on these priorities. I'm wondering if you got comments on that one, Mussy.
Thank you, Member for Deschaux. Madam Premier?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Absolutely. That was the whole purpose of the initial calls, was to talk to them about their negotiations, to do an introduction, talk about doing business different, and we also talked about the UNDRIP and being in our priorities. We have been soliciting for feedback from them. We've already got, I think there's 2 or 3 that we've gotten already on this. So it has been put forward, and there's already movement on it. I do want to clarify, it's not all Indigenous groups that I've met with, it's Indigenous governments, because if I was to call every Indigenous group, I don't think I'd be sitting here today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Deschaux.
Yeah, Mussy, just to clarify, was that the regional governments? Is that who you're talking about? Like there's the KHO, there's a DECHO, there's a... Thank you.
Madam Premier?
Thank you, Madam Chair. To clarify, yes, it's the regional governments, so the ones that are in the land claims and the self-government negotiation, what I focused on, although some of them are not regional because not all of them are part of a regional land claim or self-government negotiations. So sometimes I had to phone them, the chiefs and communities, versus actually a regional rep. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. All right, so if there are no further questions on this, Mr. Simpson, Hay River South.
Thank you. I guess it's part of the government's mandate, it's part of our priorities, so I see it's something that we've got to initiate, whether it's writing letters or contacting the Indigenous groups and saying, okay, we got to sit down and talk about this and come up with something to move ahead. Because I guess when in the territories throughout the years, I suspect at one point in time it was mostly Aboriginal First Nations people here, Indigenous peoples. And as time went on, more people, non-Aboriginal people came from the south to provide us programs and services, and eventually it's going to flip where it's going to be more non-Indigenous or more non-Aboriginal people here. So we got to make sure that the Indigenous groups are involved in this, and we've got the Constitution to think about, we've got the Indian Act, we've got land claim agreements, we've got self-government agreements, and I think all of that has a bearing on what this is. I think, I guess we have to start somewhere, and just like everything else, like the Constitution, Indian Act, all that, there's case law related to all that. And I suspect at one point, when this is implemented, when we implement this, we're going to see some case law with that as well. There's going to be challenges. Some of it might be straightforward. Other parts, as Indigenous groups, are going to use that to our benefit. So But we have to do something, just like everything that else is out there. Something was done at one point, and this is just another, just something else to strengthen Indigenous rights in Canada. So it's up to us. It's part of our priority. It's part of the mandate. We've got to take the initiative and go out there and meet with the First Nations and the Indigenous groups and establish a plan of action so we can do something with it sooner than later. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Even if this wasn't in our priorities, the land claims and self-government agreements, I would be pushing this anyway. I believe it's a win-win situation. We've had members talk about no economy means no social programs. The Indigenous governments, and I will use IRC for an example, who did settle, I look at where their nation's going. The economy is growing. There are more people that get jobs mean less people on the N.W.T burden. So we have less people on income support, less people on public housing. So it's a win-win. I've been putting that forward to every Indigenous government. This is not about us giving something up. This is about us working together. And if we look at it as a win-win, then we're coming in with the right attitude. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Hay. Okay. If there is there any further questions to this item? Okay. Are there any further questions on implement UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People? Seeing none, committee, we will move on to page 10. Increase regional decision-making authority. Questions? No? Oh, okay. Member for Tabacha.
I just want to, Madam Chair, I just want to make sure that, I just want to say that this is an excellent priority. I think when the decision-making was taken away from regions and communities, our people in the communities and regions do not want to come to headquarters for decisions. They would like to have those decisions made at their level. And I think that's an excellent move, and on behalf of all of us here when we made this priority, and I want to thank everybody in the room for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Member for Tabacha. Madam Premier, you have.
Thank you. I'll take that as a comment.
Member for Tabacha, did you have anything else? Okay, so I'll move on to Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Madam Chair. During my time here with the 19th Legislative Assembly, I've had the opportunity to get to know a lot of the members that sit around this room. And although I grew up in the North and felt I had a very good understanding of everything that happened in the North, I've learned that I learn something new every day from my colleagues here. So my question would be, how does the N.W.T intend to work with people from regions to decide what powers need to be devolved to the regions and how they're going to do that in a meaningful way? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Mr. Goldney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the expectation is to begin with an inventory of where decision-making rests within our organization now, identify opportunities where it might be better placed in the regions and in communities, and have discussions with regional staff and community staff to verify some of that. And we might learn through those discussions there are things that we've missed. So very much expect it to be an ongoing conversation that starts with that departmental review of what the authorities look like now, and leads to implementation of more authority in the communities through that type of engagement. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Goldie. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I see here that there is a spot for training provided to make sure that communities are well prepared to take on the decision-making authorities. Will there be ongoing check-ins and ongoing support to make sure that we can keep that decision-making authority within the communities and empower them to continue on that road? Thank you.
Madam Premier.
You can call me Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. Absolutely. And as training as well, training is only as good as the people that received the training, so it shouldn't be something that is done one time and just left, so it should be something that's ongoing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Okay, I will move on to member for Trinidad Willowday.
Masicho, Madam Chair. It sounded like earlier you got another promotion there. I really like this mandate item as well, and I really got a good sense of it too when we sat around a round table in October with all the regions. That was so powerful. Just hearing them, and what really surprised me was saying they told the regions that they're telling us that they had never met with us like that in that forum before, and it blew me away. I think that needs to have that collaboration. We need to work with each other. For too long, I think there's that the division between the N.W.T and the regions, and like feeling the regions felt ignored, and I think now it was starting to bridge that now, and that makes me very happy, and I think this is a good direction to go in. And my question for the Premier is, I'm looking here at the timeline for summer 2021. It says how we'll demonstrate progress, and there's a training program that will be developed. Can she just expand a little bit on what this training program is going to be like, and just give us some high-level content, what's going to be in that training program?
Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the training actually, right now, it doesn't have a blueprint. It will depend on the first item within it that talks about that we'll be looking at where decision-making can do, and then we'll be having to assess what training is needed. So it's a bit early today to say what training will look like when we don't know what we're dealing with at this point. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Trinidad Willowday.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for that response, Madam Premier. Okay, with this, the parliamentary review, this is the winter of 2021. What steps are we going to be expected to get this work done over the summer? What kind of work is your office are we going to do between now and this timeline? Let's see.
Thank you, Member for Trinidad Willowday. Madam Premier.
Winter, that we'll be doing the work for
Okay.
decision.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I was a little bit confused on what timeline, but it's actually this winter. We're going to be already starting to get the departments to do the review. So I'm not sure if that was the answer to your question or if there was more you wanted. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Premier. You're good? Okay. All right, so I will move on to member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just be brief here on this. I guess in the regions we do have some regional authority there right now, and the problem, some of it's good, but the problem is that it depends on who the person is that has that authority, and a lot of times the fairness, it lacks fairness. And we see that, like I see it in my community, and I suspect others see it in their community as well. So I think that when we look at devolving some of this, we should come up with something and put something in place so that we can monitor that. Otherwise, I guess one way to monitor is that people come to us as MLAs and complain. So, but there's got to be something, I guess, some training and some ownership by the people making the decisions, and there's got to be a process that's, you know, that can be followed, and that's just provides fairness, I guess, is the big thing. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Hay River South. Madam Premier.
I agree, Madam Chair, so we need to have some kind of a way of monitoring it, evaluating it. You know, on one hand, over the last 4 years, I've heard train our people, give our people the skills, put them in our jobs, and then on the other hand, I hear you can't have my people in there because they're friends with this family and that family, so so we do have to make sure that there is a monitoring to make sure that biases do not persist, especially in the smaller regions where that's more of a liability. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Hay River South. All right. Okay, so that, if there are any further questions on the increased regional decision-making authority? Seeing none, committee will move on to page 11. Reduce the municipal funding gap. Questions? Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the municipal funding gap, it's not exactly a fixed target because it grows with inflation. So can I just confirm with whether we're going to close the gap by 5 million, factoring in the fact that it's consistently growing, so that this priority would actually cost something more than 5 million? Is that correct?
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the expectation is that we will try to avoid grouping them in, that we will close it by 5 million, recognizing, I know that we might get challenged that it's not enough money, etc., but it's the best we can do with the resources we have. Tough decisions have to be made. The territorial government, if we did an assessment of what we're short, I think that we would blow ourselves out of the water. So I know that the communities always cry 40 million, and I feel it, but I also feel our own debt. So we have to be realistic within that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Yellowknife North.
Sorry, I'm not sure that clarified my question. So we've thrown money at this before, but you know, if you don't put enough money to keep pace with the deficit as it grows, you don't actually close the gap. So can I just clarify that if it's 40, the goal is to get it to 35, and then this will cost us more than $5 million. Is that correct?
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Madam Premier.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Goldney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And part of the thinking for that $5 million number was recognizing, yes, that the old numbers we have might not be current, but at the same time, recognizing that if we were to do that exercise all over again, it would lead to more work and discussion. I think the commitment we're trying to express is, you know, at a minimum, improve the fiscal capacity by adding investments of at least $5 million.
Thank you, Mr. Goldney. Member for Yellowknife North.
I suspect that I'll ask this question at a later time, and I think there needs to be some analysis of, you know, whether we're just providing 5 million flat or whether we're closing the gap by 5 million, because those are different numbers. And I guess my next question is this is coming in the next 3 budgets, 21, 22, 23, is the anticipation that we will those will all be equal amounts of the 5 million, and whether it's 5 million plus, so will it be equally distributed?
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Madam Premier.
Thank you. Madam Chair. So we have agreed to work with the N.W.T. Association of Communities on this. There is a funding formula, but in fairness, some communities, the $40 million gap is not across the board. Some communities, when they did the assessment, were above. And so previous government said they would be grandfathered. Is it fair that they get another share? Those are questions that we need to work with the Association of Communities on. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Yellowknife North? No? Okay. So, are there any further questions? Oh, all right. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like, I'm not sure throwing $5 million at it's going to do anything. You know, if we just keep it, I guess, try to stop it from growing. Because the problem is that our communities have aging infrastructure that we've got to deal with. And that's what we got to throw money at. And so I think that, you know, we're looking at trying to reduce the debt. All right, I think what we should be doing is trying to just maintain it so it doesn't get any bigger, and then try and grow the economy, and deal with some of the other issues. And it gives us a little time to kind of regroup and really think about the issue. So just a comment. Thank you.
All right. I will take that as a comment. Madam Premier, did you want to respond?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The only thing I will say is there's 3 pots. I'm trying to remember what they are. It's capital, operating and maintenance, and wastewater. Wastewater. Okay. It's been a while since I've been back at water and sewer. So the difficulty that I've noticed that over the years is that the communities keep screaming, we need our 40 million, 40 million, 40 million, but we have almost matched them for the operating and maintenance and the water and sewer. The piece that's left is the capital. However, what they're not including in that is that MACA has done an awesome job over the years of actually getting federal money for the capital. So at no time has that federal money been taken into account on this $40 million, and that's what I struggle with as an MLA, is that they're saying it's still 40 million, we need the money, but they're not adding the money from the federal government. And at some time they have to do this. If you look at our mandates, some of this is about them generating their own, giving them the ability so they can generate their own. So we have to do a better job of communicating that it's not only the GNWT, they need to take into account the federal money, and they need to take into account their own ability to earn money. We're all in a tough spot. I think I heard that today again. The only way we can make money is from royalties, federal government, and taxes. But many of the governments don't want to raise taxes, and neither do we. So, but we all have to take ownership in this, because not one of us is in a position that we have money growing on trees. We're all in debt. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I agree. The communities have to do something themselves. They've got to. We've been doing the same thing, the same way for years, and we have to reinvent ourselves somehow. And I guess I think about Hay River, and I look at, you know, the bylaws, and I look at all that. You know, people are looking for tiny homes. Yet we say you got to build a house a certain size on a lot. Well, times are changing, and we got to make those changes. And if we can do that, and sometimes if you can reduce, maybe you can reduce the cost a bit. And if that brings in more people into the north, you know, that's another $30-some thousand for us. And so those are the type of things we got to do. But those are conversations that this government's got to have with the communities as well, and let them know that, you know, there's got to be some active change here. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Agreed. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you, Madam Premier. Are there any further questions on reduce the municipal funding gap? Oh, Member for Tabacha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess my question is reducing the funding gap by $5 million. If the funds are going to be distributed evenly over the communities and including Yellowknife, I mean, how much does that leave for a community? How is it going to be done? Is it going to be done by demand, or is it going to be done by per capita, or is it going to be done by, like, I'd like to know that.
Oh, MACA. Minister responsible for MACA.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll try to make this short. I wanted to express that with the funding gap that that MACA currently has with the $40 million, we try our best to not let the communities feel that breakdown. And looking at, we've entered into new opportunities. One of them I'm kind of excited about is the lotteries for the Northwest Territories, that we are taking it over as a government to generate revenue for our sports and recreation, which is probably our largest expenditure as well too, and looking at the water and waste management for the smaller communities and the upgrades and land tenure, and looking at the function that they hold as a municipality. Going forward, I would really like to emphasize on the property taxation as well too, and really putting out a lot of emphasis on it, so the communities would come to a more of a clear understanding on to look at generating revenue at a local level. But I really want to stress that 87% of that of the funding that MACA receives goes out to the smaller communities, and we do our best to try to not let the communities feel that cut, but then actually looking at the infrastructure that is built. They do have funding that is available to them, and they do come up with their own capital plan, their own budget, and they identify how that money is going to be spent at a community local level. I just wanted to make that clear, if that's good. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Madam Premier, did you have anything to add?
Thank you, Madam Chair. What I'd like to expand is we talked about $5 million, but if you look down further, we're talking about a process to transfer lands. There's a value to lands when we put that in. So we tried to do, for example, there was when I was the, I can't remember which minister I was at the time, but we brought in the hotel tax so that communities could actually take that tax and actually implement that, and it's still not off the ground. So like the member had said, we need to work with the governments. We can give it to them, but my worry is we're going to give them land, we're going to make legislation to make it easier, we're going to give them $5 million, and they're going to still say we're still $35 million short. So at some point we're going to have those tough conversations that says this land is equal to that, and a tough conversation that said when you got federal government money for your capital, that is equaling off of that. So those are conversations we have to have, because there is a value to land, there's a value to all of these things that we're doing for them. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Tabacha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't think either one of you has answered my question. I said, is it going to be by need when they, or is it going to be by per capita, the $5 million distributed?
Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I do know that there is a funding formula that is worked on with the N.W.T. Association of Communities. We work closely with them on this. They represent all communities. All communities have a say in that organization. But I will commit to actually finding out more information for the member. All I know is that we work with them. They help us allocate, and that is that they represent all communities. They allocate where the monies go to. And that is done in partnership. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Tabacha.
So it's not by need, it's by per capita, or is it just the
Thank you, Madam Premier.
So perhaps I will clarify, and I won't have to come back and give an explanation. So the original, when we did the needs assessment of the deficit in municipal governments, was done by need. There was no per capita. It was, what do you need in your community? Do you need a water treatment plan? Do you need a sewer plant? Do you need roads? And so it is by need. It has always been by need. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member, you're good? Okay. Are there any further questions on the reduced municipal funding gap? Seeing none, committee, we will move on to page 12. Strengthen the government's leadership authority on climate change. Questions? Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I see here that one of the actions is this Northwest Territories Climate Change Council, and that's great. But what is our government going to do internally to make sure that ENR is the lead on this matter? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Minister of ENR would like to take this question.
Minister of ENR.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the Department of ENR is proud to lead in regards to climate change, but we work closely with all the other departments. It's just not ENR, but it's the government of the Northwest Territories trying to deal with this. So we're taking the lead. We're working with the departments, but each department needs to be working together to help us deal with this situation or this climate change issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister for ENR. Madam Premier.
I think since the Premier, I will say that as with the last Assembly, there will be committees formed to Cabinet. One of the committees will be around the climate change and so economy and environment. So we will all ministers, applicable ministers, will be sitting around that table. So it will be interdepartmental. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I haven't heard anything different from the way this was handled in the last Assembly. The Auditor General of Canada, the climate change audit that was conducted here said one of the main problems was that there was no policy, no legislation that clearly established responsibility and authority when it came to the climate change issue. So I don't see anything here that addresses this issue. There's this Climate Change Council, which is external, will include N.W.T presumably, but there's nothing in here about how we're going to organize ourselves internally. We had a climate change committee cabinet last time around, and it didn't lead to any kind of leadership. So should I be reading into this somehow that there's going to be a cabinet-approved policy or legislative change that's going to set up the right kind of structure and authority and responsibility internally within N.W.T to make sure that we don't end up failing another audit? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Madam Premier.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Those are discussions we haven't had yet, but what I can say is that we are working with the other two territories across the north to actually look at how we address climate change. That meeting will happen in the spring, so after that I'll have more information on where all three territories are going. At this point, I don't have the information. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I commend the Premier for working with Nunavut and Yukon. We have a lot in common on the climate change issue, and that's great. That still is not going to help us get any better organized internally within our own government. And so the Minister said that's not something they've talked about. Kind of astounds me because that was the main finding of the audit, and we haven't actually addressed it. It's in the climate change strategic framework, and the discussion in there is that it's something that that we're going to look at some options and further study. So this is a failure in our mandate to not address that issue. And I'll be on the Minister and the 3 years, but I'm hoping that they will see the light and agree that we need to get ourselves better organized, whether it's a cabinet-approved policy or legislation, to make sure that we have the right structure and authority in place. That's all I have. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Madam Premier?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I want to reiterate that I'm not adverse to making a policy on it. I think the better strategy is to work with the 3 territories so that we have a stronger voice. Once the 3 territories have decided what we're moving, it may end up being a policy that we implement across. I'm guessing that there would have to be something that we'd implement across. So at this point, I think that if the questions come to us after the spring, we would have more information on what that looks like. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Are there any further questions on strengthening the government's leadership and authority on climate change? Seeing none, committee, we will move on to page 13. Ensure climate change impacts are specifically considered when making government decisions. Questions? Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So, what specific tool, legislation, policy is going to ensure that when decisions, significant and important decisions are made by the government, that climate change becomes a consideration? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Madam Premier?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So there'll be a number of things. One thing we are looking at is, like I said, within our cabinet package, we've talked about climate change being a standard that we'll look at all the time. Without disclosing too much about what goes in cabinet, we do have, with every decision that comes on, there's kind of a risk management description that comes with that. We can add climate change within that risk management so that every decision that comes through our cabinet table does have that climate change focus on it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Frame Lake?
Thanks, Madam Chair. So, never having been in cabinet, how, an FMB submission, or a request for funding, whatever, are there guidelines or is there a template that determines how it's laid out and what risks are outlined and considered and discussed in a submission for funding? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Madam Premier?
Thank you, Madam Chair. With every decision that comes across Cabinet, absolutely, there is a risk management assessment that happens. For example, 2 that come to my head right now are legal. Are there any legal ramifications of this? The other one is financial. Are there any financial ramifications? So again, to add climate change, are there any climate change impacts? That's something that would be done. And every department that puts forward a proposal to Cabinet has to fill those out. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Frame Lake?
Thanks, Madam Chair. I don't think the Premier understood my question, so I'll try again. Is there a policy? Is there guidelines? What is the document or the authority that says that legal considerations need to be discussed in an FMB submission? And is it possible that could be amended in some way to include climate change? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Madam Premier?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thought that's what I said, but I'll let Martin Goldney expand on that for me. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Goldney?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And yes, there are submission guidelines for both Financial Management Board decisions that are being requested and Cabinet decisions that include some of the factors that the Premier has described. And yes, it is the expectation that climate change can be added to those factors so that departments are required to consider them when making those submissions, and they'll be assessed and reviewed and advice provided to both the Financial Management Board and Cabinet as they're considering those decisions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Goldie. Madam Premier?
So thank you, Madam Chair. That is one tool that will be different. I mean, we will still have our Environment and Economy Cabinet Committee, but I took heed that that was nothing changed from the other assembly. We are looking for change, so we will add the climate change into our decision-making at the Cabinet table. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Frame Lake?
Thanks, Madam Chair. So how do we demonstrate to the public and how can Cabinet convince even us as regular MLAs that climate change does become a consideration in important decisions or FMB submissions? How is that going to be documented and reported in any way? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Madam Premier?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Cabinet decisions are confidential. We won't be reporting on Cabinet decisions. That is something that has remained in Cabinet. However, we are doing a yearly reporting on our climate change actions and stuff, so you will see some of that information in there. You can also challenge us on the floor. You can ask us. Every department, I mean, even when I was housing, I mean, the whole move was moving into getting more energy efficient. I think our energy rating was 80, if I remember right, and it was getting, better triple pane windows and solar panels, and, so that's already happening. It's just a matter of solidifying it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Frame Lake?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, I'm challenging the Premier right now about how we ensure and where the evidence is going to be and how the public is to find out about that evidence, that climate change will actually become a consideration in terms of funding new programs, services, infrastructure projects, those kind of trade-offs. And I guess I'm hearing that there's some kind of guidelines that might get changed, that there might be a cabinet committee that looks a little bit different. I'm not getting a lot of comfort that this is actually going to result in evidence-based decision-making and some sort of change in the way that we actually do business here. Maybe I need to have an offline discussion with them, but I just, maybe I don't understand the process clear enough, but there should be either a policy or legislation that clearly sets out that climate change has to be a consideration in major government decisions. And that has to be documented. I understand the need for cabinet confidences and all of that, but how do we actually demonstrate to the public that climate change is something serious and that this government is actually considering it when it makes decisions? I just not really getting the kind of clarity, I guess, that I'd hoped for. Thanks, Madam Chair. And I don't really know how much more I can push this, because I just don't detect that we're going to have in place the kind of policy, legislation, leadership that the Auditor General called on us to do, to demonstrate climate leadership. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Madam Premier?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like I said, that we are working with the other territories so that we are a unified voice. There will be some action coming out of that, public announcements coming out of that. We will be doing a yearly reporting on these issues. What I'd like to recommend, Madam Chair, is we're open to listening. If the member or other members want to come and provide suggestions, we're more than open to listen to that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. All right. Are there any further questions on ensure climate change impacts are specifically considered when making government decisions? Seeing none, committee will move on to page 15. Increase employment in small communities. Questions? Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Looking at this priority, I noticed that there is a section here for developing mentorship programs to support emerging entrepreneurs. I'm wondering who is involved in this mentorship program, and does it involve northern business owners? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Madam Premier?
Thank you, Madam Chair. At this point, I'm not sure who would be on the mentorship program. We will have to get back to committee on that. But I think that we're open to have businesses on that. It would make sense. Thank you, Madam Chair. If you want to try the minister.
Infrastructure or industry, tourism? Okay, Minister for Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Program is not been developed yet, so they are open to any sorts of suggestions. One thing I have found with ITI is they're definitely not a this is the way it has to be kind of department, and they're pretty flexible in some of, well, you can laugh, Kevin, but they are very flexible sometimes in their ways of doing it. And when we've been discussing things with all of these sorts of changes that we're going to be doing, a lot of it will be end user feedback. I've had that conversation a lot with the department. So if there is a need, and clearly if we're going to talk about business, we'd want mentors to be business people. So I don't see why they wouldn't be part of that program.
Thank you, Minister of ITI. Cam Lake, member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I look forward to watching the development of this mentorship program. I think that mentorship is a huge opportunity in the North, especially for people who do want to get into business. But I think that business ownership is far more than being very skilled at a trade. There is an element of being fiscally responsible that's very important, especially when we're supporting people through business development, through seed money or anything like that. And so I think it'd be prudent that we make sure that we're setting people up to the best of their ability. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Cam Lake. Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We would make sure that we cover the full spectrum, because the member is right. You're not just going to take any business. A lot of businesses fail very quickly. So, but we also have other programs, business development, corporation, etc., that do specialize in that. So it'll be working hand in hand. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Are there any other questions? I'll go to Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm wondering what the metric we're measuring this against is, because if you actually look at the labor market forecast, we're going to lose far more than 125 jobs in the next 4 years in our small communities. That's just the economic reality we're facing. So when we see increase by 125, do we mean that we're actually, despite the projected loss of jobs, going to increase 125? Or are we just talking about ITI going out and creating programs that then offsets the projected loss by 125? Like, what are we pegging this against? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we have a small community fund, actually, that we provide to communities to actually start their own jobs or skill development. I think I've said already in this House, when I was the minister, my difficulty was and I've said that vocally, and I'll keep saying that, we tended to throw out money. It's like, here's $5 million, spend it. And then people would get 2 weeks here and 2 weeks there. And so I've been saying for the last year or so, when I started to realize that this wasn't a good idea, so I've been talking to communities and saying, instead of hiring that truck driver to haul gravel into your community for 2 weeks, why don't you buy the truck so that you can hire the truck driver that always has? So we're trying to move into a more sustainable model of small community using the money that we have, instead of just saying, here's the money, spend it, and make sure you give me a report on who you hired for every 2 weeks, because that model is not working. We're not seeing the benefits of that other than short-term employment, and that should not be where we're looking at. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Yellowknife North.
Yeah, thank you. This is just, once again, goes back to that accountability piece. It's going to be very easy for us to, create 125 new jobs if we create some programmings and then claim those new jobs that emerge. But my question is, is this taking into fact the labor market forecast, the needs assessment, which says we're going to be losing jobs over the next 4 years? So is this a net increase of 125, or is this just 125 that can be directly correlated to G&W.T projects and programs? And if there's not an answer to this right now, I'm glad to have ITI or someone come back to committee. I just need to know, are we expecting to outpace the labor market forecast and all of the projections we have right now? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Madam Premier.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Our commitment is to getting 125, I need my reading glasses, jobs in small communities. This is not talking about Yellowknife or bigger regions. So we can't control the market and who's going to move and come, but what I can say is that there's a lot less mobility going south of people, residents leaving from small communities than there are from Yellowknife or larger centres. So if this goal is specifically for small communities, there is less migration out of small communities, outside of the territories. They tend to come to Yellowknife. Thank you, Madam Chair. Or Nuvik. So, Madam Chair, I think Minister wanted to, Minister wants to say something.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Minister of Housing, sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to comment on the increase of employment in smaller communities. Coming from a smaller community, there is a limited amount of employment that is existing. Looking at this initiative, I was looking at the partnerships that could be created. Being the Minister of Northwest Territories Housing Corporation and putting houses on the ground, we're looking at employment and training and creating employment for the housing for the residents in the smaller communities that way. Also looking at partnerships, we do have, speaking to my colleague for Minister of Lands, and identifying that we do have protected area strategies that are underway as we speak now, and they do have program development where we end up in entering into partnerships with the G&W.T and the smaller communities, and looking at forecasted projects that are coming forward. I want to just comment on the Toledo Bridge that is underway, that we do have environmental assessments and planning going forward, and that is going to create employment in a smaller area for the Sahtu region. I just wanted to be clear on that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister of Housing. Madam Premier, did you have something to?
Thank you. Just a quick note, Madam Chair. If you look at the second thing, it says support small community with Indigenous governments, including opportunities associated with established candidate protected areas. With the protected areas, there's opportunities for recreation and culture, for tourism, the guardianship programs. The Housing Minister talked about apprenticeship programs. There is opportunities for small communities to have sustainable jobs. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Yellowknife North. We'll go on to member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess when it comes to employment in small communities, that's something I guess I want to see. I want to see opportunities there for the people that are living there. And when we look at that, it's more than just saying we're going to create jobs. We have to look at the programs and that we currently have in place and the institutions. Like we've got the BIP. We got to use that properly. We've got ITI programs, SEED, etc. We've got the BDIC. We got Community Futures. We got the N.W.T. Métis Development Corporation, which isn't part of the government. There's federal programs. There's education, culture, and employment with respect to training. We've got infrastructure, which has projects and supplies and available work. But in the small communities, I see like the arts and crafts is a big thing. For years, they've been talking about a tanning facility in Fort Providence. Never seen anything happen with it. We got tourism. In small communities, we've got, there may be opportunities for private housing maintainers and that type of thing. We've got, requirement for trades. And like in Fort McPherson, we got tent and canvas. And whether it makes money or not, I don't, it'd be nice if it made money. It may not make money. But it provides jobs. It helps maybe with education, and it gives people, I guess, some hope and gives people, or allows them to, show their kids and that there's opportunities out there no matter where you are. So I think when we look at this, it's a bigger picture than just creating jobs. We have to look at everything else we have in place, and it's housing. Like, you got to have, people got to have a place to live as well. And so I think when we look at this, I think it's really important that we tie all this in together. But I don't want to be looking at it for 4 years either. Timelines are good. Try and get something done. It's just easy to go out there and do a few little things and get them going. So I'm optimistic that something's going to happen. And again, when it comes to business and employment, that's going to be my area where I want to push, and you'll hear lots from me about that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, member for Hay River South. Madam Premier.
Thank you, and thank you, member, for giving the examples. You're absolutely right. One thing I'd like to, within our definition of how we'll do it, we do talk about maker spaces. There's a lot of artisans in our smaller communities. That will help them as well. The other thing is and so a lot of times these mandates overlap, and so we talk about increasing childcare spaces, so that in that way we're talking about changing our income support and our housing policies that say you can't operate childcare in your house. Those will bring employment in. If we need to deal with the lack of childcare in some of these small communities, we open up the housing policies that says now you can provide licensed childcare provision in your home. Those are small community jobs that will stay there. They're sustainable. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Toonaday-Willowday.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to say that I was really pleased about this the amending of the policy to the N.W.T Housing Corporation to allow appropriate home business opportunities with their units. And I mentioned during our roundtable before we were assigned our portfolios, we got to help those single parents out there, and this is a perfect one. And I talked a little bit about humanizing our policies. This is it here. This made me really happy. I'm glad we're moving in that direction, and hopefully we see more of that from the Department of Housing and Department of Health. But that's another battle. For when I look at this, I try to visualize, a struggling single parent in their home with kids are asleep and they're on the computer and they're trying to work at their next big thing. I look at these business opportunities for people within their units, and who knows, the next Amazon, the next Apple, the idea could be happening in one of those living rooms, and this is an opportunity that made me happy. That's why I look at. That's the idealist coming out of me. So this is a good start. So I want to say I'm very happy about that. But my question is to the Premier for, I want to talk a little bit about the distribution of 125 jobs. We have a breakdown of kind of our KPI, our key performance indicators from the fall 2020 to fall 2023. But there really isn't no breakdown by region. I know each of us in our own region, especially for some of the smaller communities, we could use 30 jobs alone in our community. So that's something I think that should be addressed a little more. So ask the Premier, how is this breakdown, how do you project this is going to look by region?
Thank you, Member for Toonaday-Willowday. Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this is a pretty conservative. Again, I realize some people are going to be judging us in 2 years on the mandate to see if it's accomplished or change it, and other people are going to be judging us trying to take us out of our seats. So I purposely have done that. I know that. That's fair. There is no way actually to say that we will have 10 jobs in this one and 10 jobs in that one. Once we open up just the public housing alone, that's, it might just flood. We've got people I know that are making slippers. I buy, and I'm going to be careful here because I buy my wood from Betchico, and I hide every time the wood's delivered. Once we make these legal, who knows what's going to come out. So I think it would be inappropriate to actually give a number and say this much per region. I want to see as much as possible. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier.
Madam Chair, I think the Minister have an answer. Do you have an answer, Madam? Okay, she's going to give you an answer. How many per community?
Minister, is it MACA? Huh? Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to elaborate on the question because I went and started to look at this kind of like in the same way that you've seen it. And I want to emphasize on the government and the infrastructure projects that we do have throughout the Northwest Territories, where those numbers will increase, where I would like to see a lot of emphasis on the community, on the government programs that we have for small businesses to take advantage of. I just wanted to share a short little story with you. In the Sawtooth, we had this lady who went ahead and received some money from ITI, purchased a food truck. She ended up with a $5 million contract from Imperial Oil, and right now she is a business owner, sole business owner. So looking at projects like this throughout the Northwest Territories, trying to measure them, depends on what activity is happening within those regions, but also emphasizing on the programs that we have, the funding programs that people can actually apply for, and educating them enough to become successful and to have more successful stories like that throughout the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Chena. Member for Trinidad Willett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the responses. Just one more quick question on this policy I mentioned earlier about home business. So are we going to give, maybe this might be more a question for the Minister from ECE, but are we going to give home business owners that are in public units some grace period to not have their rents just skyrocket because they're making a little bit of income? Are we going to, or have their income assistance be cut off because of just starting out to have a startup business? So are we going to allow for a little bit of space for them to breathe to get them started? Mr. Chair.
Okay. Minister of ECE.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think the question was about income assistance and whether or not there'll be a bit of a grace period when someone starts making money and whether their income assistance. Right now, if you start making money, you get a full-time job, and you make too much for income assistance, that means income assistance no longer pays your rent, they don't pay your heating, they don't pay your electricity, you might not have health care, and so the member is pointing out that perhaps that's keeping people from getting and maintaining meaningful employment. So those are discussions I've had with my department, those are discussions that I've had with the members, and those are discussions I'm going to have with Cabinet as well, because we've been doing the same thing for a while, and we see that there are improvements that could be made. So I'm open to having those conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister of ECE. Are you okay? All right. So if there are there any further questions on increased employment to small communities? Seeing none, I will call upon Mr. Norn.
Yeah. I'd like to rise and report progress.
Okay. There's a motion on the floor to report progress. The motion is in order and non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will now rise and report progress.
Thank you. May I have the report of Committee of the Whole. Member for N.W.T. Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering table document 1219 to 2019 to 2023 mandate of the Government of Northwest Territories and would like to report progress. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Hay River North. Motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Not today, eh? Member Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member from the Henday, that Bill 1, Supplementary Appropriation Act, Infrastructure Expenditures Number 3, 2019-2020, be read for the third time. And, Mr. Speaker, I would request a recorded vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. The member has requested a recorded vote. All those in favor, please rise.
The member for Yellowknife South, the member for Sawtoo, the member for Range Lake, the member for Inuvik Boot Lake, the member for Great Slave, the member for Hay River North, the member for Inuvik Twin Lakes, the member for Yellowknife Centre, the member for Hay River South, the member for Thabacha, the member for Tunadao-Welladay, the member for Frame Lake, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Day Cho, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Nahende.
All those opposed, please rise. All those abstaining, please rise. Oh, thank you. The results of the recorded vote, 16 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstention. The motion is carried. Bill 1 has had third reading. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Thursday, February 13th, 2020, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgments, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to commissioner's address, petitions, reports of committees on the review of bills, reports of standing and special committees, tabling of documents, notices of motions, motion 3-19-2, notice of motion for first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, table document 12-19-2, table document 17-19-2, report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. This House stands adjourned until Thursday, February 13th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m. Order.